Welcome to Resilient Minds, Inclusive Planet. My name is Rindel Papa, and I am the founder of Virtual Oasis Tech. And we are bridging communities to talk about climate change impact on all of us, specifically our mental health. And the reason that we're bringing it across different communities is because there are different communities that are going to be impacted more adversely in the face of climate change. So Resilient Minds, Inclusive Planet is about the resiliency that we can foster internally and the inclusivity that is necessary for all of us. So in this second series and event for World Mental Health Day on October 10th, we're going to hear from two individuals who bridge psychology into their initiatives. One is a current professor at University of Texas, and the other works with individuals in the Denver and Colorado community to talk about eco-anxiety in their spaces. So let's dive in. Resilient Minds, Inclusive Planet is a three-part event series starting with our second event tonight. This is a series that is bridging and bringing communities across the spectrum to talk about what climate change means to them, to create awareness, connection, collaboration, and bridge solutions. All three events that we are hosting will have a theme of mental health because climate change greatly impacts our external environment, but also our internal one. And as research increasingly shows, this is pivotal for not only ourselves, but the public health community, public health field, and planetary health. So tonight we're going to be hearing from Dr. Stephanie Cawthon for the World Mental Health Day. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge where we are in the land and the space. Tonight, I'm currently on the Senaha and Pohotecan lands. And if you'd like to find and understand and honor the lands that you live on, you can look at nativeland.ca. The rest of today's talk is going to be including the keynote speak from Dr. Stephanie Cawthon from her recent book, Disability is Human, which is a very pressing conversation. Our panel session will be led by Rhiannon Gallagher, and we will have a breakout session and group dialogue. 15% of global population has an intellectual or physical disability. That's roughly 30 million of individuals who will become climate refugees by 2050. That's going to require different kinds of support. This is a quote and research that's coming from Harvard's Global School of Education. And which is why it's very pressing that we're having this conversation about disability and climate change, because we need to think about the solutions that our communities are going to need now. So, without further ado, here is our keynote speaker, Dr. Stephanie Cawthon. She is a deaf researcher, author, and speaker, professor at University of Texas in the Department of Educational Psychology with a courtesy appointment in special education. She is an internationally renowned expert for her research that examines the multiple factors that affect how deaf and disabled people succeed in classrooms, workplaces, and throughout their lives. She investigates issues of equity and education and explores accommodations and accessibility in the learning environments and challenges systemic standards that are holding people back. She is an inaugural affiliate of the Texas Center for Equity Promotion. It houses the Collaborative for Access and Equity, a joint project with Microsoft and UT Austin that Stephanie directs. And she founded the National Deaf Center on Post-Secondary Outcomes in 2017 and received a $20 million federal grant. She's the author of 3 books, and Stephanie is a deaf editor of the Perspectives on Deafness in Oxford University Press, an international book series on the leading research and practices with deaf people. She lives and resides in Austin, Texas, and we are so honored to hear from her tonight. And I'd like to acknowledge the sponsorships that we've received to host this virtual event, including Watts Institute, as I am a current fellow for the Sistel Planet Scale Fellowship. So here is Dr. Stephanie Cawthon.
The second piece is ableism. And so there's a disparity between the understanding of ableism and experiencing it directly. And so that's something I like to address in my presentations and how it impacts everyone. And so we need to think about ableism and keep that in the forefront of our minds as we approach this topic. And then with that in mind, accessibility and making systems accessible. We often think of an equal opportunity or an equal chance at success, but in addition to that, having dialogue about ableism and how that impacts our lives and the systems and how our systems can really support us. And so I think it's important to think about that, having the systems in place to support us when we are focusing on disabilities. So what I'd like to do now is read a little bit, a little excerpt from my book. So this would be from chapter 8, and it talks about building a disability mindset. And why people do or do not do that in their everyday life. And so, people show up every day in different contexts. One moment, please. It seems that my video might be a tad glitchy, so I need to, I'm not sure what can be done about that. I apologize. I will try to continue on. So far, so good. You just never know what's going to happen via video, do you? So accessibility and disability and why these two concepts are linked and how they're linked. And often what is avoided. It seems like people, out of fear or nerves or just being unsure, often avoid the conversation about disability or a person with disabilities. And again, we encounter many things in life where we don't know the language surrounding it. We don't know how to talk about it. We don't know how to name the thing. So when we consider that through the lens of disability, it can be awkward or uncomfortable. And so for me, I think that the starting point is to just kind of lean into that unsuredness and have the conversation. Another thing that I've noticed in my work is that disability applies to everyone. And that, knowing that, again, back to the language, people are often nervous to offend a person with a disability. And so that, again, is a fear-based approach often to disability. I know people are also concerned about breaking the law. There are laws surrounding disability and accessibility. And so if there's a requirement from the Americans with Disability Act, people are also very careful with what they say and what they do, knowing that that law is in place. And that often, again, scares people and it inhibits them from often just diving in and having that conversation. Because, again, in this particular vein, they're afraid of a lawsuit. And then there's the conversation of equity or fairness. And if you give an accommodation to a person with a disability, it becomes maybe like they're cheating or they're getting something extra. when that's clearly not the case. It's not that they are given anything to make it the opposite direction, and it's more about giving them an equitable experience. And so that's really difficult when those are things that people just kind of have in the back of their mind. And then systemic wise, that is often what we see impacted for people with disabilities. And the standards are lower sometimes for people who have disabilities. So, and then the how and the why of having their standards lowered. You know, what's good enough is often a thought that comes up. And so throughout chapter 8, I really kind of dive into those things and talk about what I've come to notice that people are afraid of, how people respond when they're asked, what is a disability? And what mindset they come from. And often, again, it's fear-based, and how to address that and kind of get through that uneasiness or not even knowing how to talk about it. Sometimes it's also, like I say, legal ramifications or a legal issue. Is it a financial issue? Is it just that the person doesn't even know where to begin or how to have that conversation? Sometimes it's about, this is just what we do. We're doing the same thing every day. And so a practice or a policy needs to be addressed, but they don't want to change that. Oh, this is what we do. This is how we've always done it. And so that can be a challenge. And people feel overwhelmed too. Oh my gosh, if we're that far off the mark, we've got to start from scratch. Where do we even begin? And so some of these issues are very real. And I find if we take a pause and take a step back and kind of get away from assumptions, asking the people who have these experiences and see what works and see what doesn't. That's a great way to approach it. I also notice as well when I start speaking to leaders in an organization or within a system, and they show up with a list of requirements like we must do this, 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 it very rarely succeeds. So when I do talk to leaders, I say, that's a thing to do. Those are, again, like a checklist, and really it's a mindset of how to be. It is more of an approach that can really help at the system level. And there's one thing that I really try to do is where to start the conversation. I find that to be a really imperative piece. And when you do that, it's critical to understand your audience, right? To get in there and really have a good way to even broach the subject. What's important to them? What motivates the people in their organization? How do they see each other? How do they view each other in that space? And when there's someone talking about, these are my needs, this is my way versus others, it really, it's difficult to have a shared experience and build that trust if it's one-way communication. I think it's very important to be curious and to ask questions of those who have that experience. And that's sort of my starting point for all things when I'm trying to convince people how to do things and maybe how to improve their business practices or even systemic change and shifts, is figure out what's important and how you can even start that conversation. And so that's sort of a little bit of a summary of some of the work that I do and some of the info in chapter 8. And again, in my research and when I talk to people, I like to know what drives them, what they want to know, what they need to know. And all of that is very important. But what I have found is that a shift in attitude is often the most important. Attitude and mindset are key to then being able to address the issues and get a sense of our perspective on disability and the people who experience disability, their worth, because often people will respond to new requirements by, oh, no, we can't do that. Or is it worth it? They're very resistant to anything new coming into their space. And so how to frame that and really get that your point across when talking to different people. So moving from is it worth it to who is going to benefit, who do we have in our system that this will benefit, like what will this be like. Also, I encourage people to acknowledge their fear, acknowledge what they don't know. It's okay. And it's important that we recognize and acknowledge that before we try to dive in and fix things. Starting slower and kind of taking that step back and acknowledging that during those preliminary conversations are really vital. So, I know you sort of already read part of my intro and introduced me and have read some of this, Ren. So thank you for that. And that's sort of my recap, I guess, of chapter 8.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing them. I have some questions prepared for us. And for anyone who's interested in learning more about the book, I'll be dropping that later in the chat. So here is our link, and feel free to connect and explore the book even further after today's event. I have a few questions for you, Dr. Cawthon, as we begin today. And the first is
Oh,
you
could you?
highlight,
I'm sorry, Rin. I'm so
yeah,
sorry to interrupt you, but I cannot see Stephen, and he is providing access in sign language to me. So
it's
if give me a second.
spotlighted now.
Okay, I think I've got him now. I'm good to go. I just with the screen sharing and everything, I just needed a second. Thank you so much. Please proceed.
Okay, sounds good. All right. So for disability, can you share more about how the work you're doing? We've highlighted a lot of amazing things that you're up to with this current book as well. So with the National Disability Center for Student Success at UT, which you founded in 2023, can you tell us more about what that mission means and what you're trying to accomplish?
Sure. So that center, the goal is to build a foundation of research, training, and understanding in terms of how post-secondary students with disabilities can be successful within that post-secondary space and beyond, so college and after. One thing that really makes a difference that we really emphasize is disabled students' experience and their perspective. They lead everyone. We've got a team of a variety of people with a wide variety of backgrounds, but it's our students that lead so many of the efforts and activities within the center, and that's been critical for moving our mission along. And so we have found thus far in our research, we've seen that mental health is really, really on the rise, the mental health issues, and we've got to prioritize that really far more than most people realize. It's really hit sort of an emergency situation for so many of our students on campus, really young people in general. And so talking about anxiety, oh gosh, we see that coming up pretty frequently, thinking about the future. What does it look like? What am I going to do? What can I do? What kind of supports will I need? What is the world looking like? And then kind of broadening that to systemic change. And so many students really feel like they just can't. And then they're not going to make an impact in the world. There's so much going on. What am I going to do? And so trying to understand that really in depth, have those students take a look at, okay, I have this disability. What does it mean to me? And so asking them, all right, what does that mean to you? What does it look like for you to be successful in college or to have a successful career? And for the generations beyond them. And take a look at, yeah, your disability, but also what are your skills? What do you bring to the table, so to speak, and how can you apply that to the rest of your life? So we really take a hard look at how they're contributing to the needs that we're identifying out in the world. So really, really very much student led.
Mm, it's beautiful and definitely very needed to hear how it's actively engaging to the need within the community body to amplify empowerment within. So that kind of bridges to a question in this space is when it goes beyond a center, beyond the university, beyond a book, what type of frameworks would you advocate for or encourage for the larger population when it comes to envisioning a regenerative and inclusive planet? And I can add more context if needed.
So I, oh no, that's fine. I think about when we want to understand the impact of really anything, and through the lens of disability, you've got to have disabled people leading that charge, leading that process, right? We can't have people without disabilities making all of the decisions and all of the plans that will impact those folks. It's an impossible, it's not going to work. So that's sort of like on a basic level. So not only representation, that is important, but full access, full participation, and leadership. So if we see people focusing solely on representation, like, oh, you're here, you've been invited, that's great, but I don't believe it's enough. With full participation, we have to think about access first and foremost. What does that look like? How can a person actively and fully participate? Yes, the invitation, a friendly culture. What does this person need to fully participate? Not just a seat at the table and that invitation, but a welcoming seat there. And what is it like? Perfect world, my best world. If I get to sit at the head of the table, what does that look and feel like? How can we do that in the best way? So framework wouldn't be like an official thing or a theory. It would be more of how we put that into practice. That's really what I would take a look at. That's what I would want to see put in place. Another thing that I'd like to add to that is to have a framework of accessibility. I feel like that has got to drive everything we do. It's everything I do: advocacy, teaching, research, writing. That's at the forefront of my mind. And then it's sort of a three-pronged approach for me when thinking about accessibility, because it requires connection first off, and that relationship, and connection to myself. I need the opportunity, um, as a disabled person, to live well, to live real and authentically, to be who I am. Relationships are important, and access provides those opportunities to build those relationships. The second thing is access to information, to the what. So many times, often we see very limited information going out for people with disabilities. Let's say emergency management, right? Any emergency, is text coming out, or is it a newscast without captioning? How are people able to respond and engage? Those sorts of that sort of language and information deprivation is really, really awful. It's a horrible experience for the disabled community, and it's so vital and so important to me. Because then it becomes, I bridge those two things together: your relationship to the information, vital. So access to those two things, and then so relationship to each other, relationship to myself, to the information, and relationship within a community to other people. So important. That is just, I feel so strongly about that, and it's vital again to people with disabilities. That's how we grow and change. So community for us, because if you're not connected to a community, you often feel left out, and you are left out, and you don't get to engage in all those ways. So those are the two frameworks that I would say. Yeah.
Powerful reminders for community, relationship, and access that acknowledges disability. Beautifully said. With your experiences as well as your research, I'm curious to know, and you've already mentioned some of this, so feel free to adjust as you will, but when it comes to embedded ableism within the disability community, what do you think is shaping our own resistance to speaking up for support?
Wow, yeah, that's interesting. So there in my book there's a story from someone who said to me, "You're not disabled enough." Okay. Okay. I mean, like I could understand that perspective, right? Like I'm a professor at the University of Texas at Austin. I have a lot of things. I know a lot of things. I have a lot of opportunities. So I could see, I could understand why someone would say that to me. But that came from a person with a disability themselves. So for me, I thought, wow, so you also have a disability. I have a disability. You're judging me instead of coming alongside me and partnering with me. That for me felt like, oh my word, we cannot afford to alienate each other. We can't afford to do that. We need everyone involved. We need to come together. And so if we see people out and about, but in isolation, we're never going to make changes. And so just sort of that perspective, what is enough? What does that even mean? And it doesn't matter. Like I said, I could understand why they said it, but if there's a disability, there's a disability. That part doesn't matter, because what is enough? How do we just define it? And why would we focus on that? So that is why I sort of reframed it and talk about how disability is human, because it includes everyone. We're not excluding anyone. We don't have any sort of like little card, right? Like, oh, I have it. But it's not a, everyone will experience a disability at one time or another in their lives. And so it really is human because it's a human experience.
100% agree. There's a, which I'm sure you're familiar for, but for anyone who's not, Microsoft has a powerful inclusive design framework that reflects temporary, situational, and permanent disability. And so it highlights that you can have someone who is an amputee, for example, with their arm missing. That's a chronic and permanent disability. But a new parent who is holding a baby is experiencing a temporary disability because of the experience as holding a child all the time. And I currently have and have always had a twin brother, and he's experienced physical impairment because of holding his newborn child. So these are very real and pressing examples that Stephanie is highlighting within this book and within their research on the powerful nature of and reflection that disability is human. And I'd love to know if anyone free to add in the chat if you have any questions for them as well, but I'll continue asking a few more. So when it comes to climate change specifically, you mentioned, this question and concern on the lack of involvement and engagement with the disability community and the isolation that is often happening for people who are not involved in a community network. This isn't one of the questions I provided for you beforehand, so it's new, but I'm wanting to highlight that how do we bridge that community? We're trying to do that in tonight's event, connecting people to the concepts and the need for advocacy when it comes to climate change. But I'd love to know what you'd like to see.
Well, I'd like to answer that in two ways. Um, the first one is history. So within the United States, Historically, it's really the parents taking on most of the the work and the motivation, so to speak, for their children on behalf of their disabled children. And we see that time and again. Parents are noticing that their children aren't getting an equal education, they're not getting equitable work opportunities, so they get out there and they fight. It's the parents taking on the system in the school and, hey, you decision makers, my kiddo is not less than. They need the same opportunities. And so it's historically been parents playing a massive role in terms of how decision makers think about disability. Again, historically, we see that everywhere. It's powerful to see the parents in there doing that type of work. So I expect if we want to see a change in the big things, I do anticipate that parents would be a part of it, a huge part. That I absolutely expect that. And it's a good thing. We need everybody coming and partnering together to make these changes. And so I encourage parents to keep doing it, jump in, roll up your sleeves, get after it, because that's where we often see changes happening. And then, as I mentioned before, disabled leaders, I think often people with disabilities don't have the experience or the training or even the opportunity to learn how to address systemic and legal business issues, and they just don't have those opportunities. And so building a pipeline of skilled and talented disabled people who can stand up and who can speak out and say, hello, I am here, these are the issues. They can make clear examples because it's lived experience. And so that's something that doesn't just happen. You don't just wake up in that space, right? It's not an automatic type thing. And so I think we need to be very intentional and go and train our youth, young and old people, but really have that mindset in terms of how we're going to advocate for climate change and change in systems for people with disability. And then how do we put that lens on it? Disability. And so if it's, personal experiences and lived experience, and those stories are so powerful. So how we can leverage that in these contexts for systemic change is just awesome, because those are the stories that get people's attention.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Oh, I saw a question come through the chat. Did you want me to answer that one?
Yes, I'll read it out loud. I have a student who is participating, and this is from Wendy Sanchez. Thank you for adding this. I have a student who is participant in my research. He is transgender, autistic, and has ADHD. The intersection of these characteristics is very interesting and can be difficult. My own children have ADHD and are on the autism spectrum. The intersection of those two is also difficult. How much does intersectionality theory impact your work?
Well, I can say quite a bit about that. I can say a lot about that. There's a chapter in my book that directly addresses that. So I'll say that, but both directly and indirectly. There are a lot of examples that you'll see multiple characteristics and intersectionality really show up. And now that you know it's there, you'll see some of those indirect examples, but also there's direct information in there. And so what I've noticed a lot within my research, what I'm working on right now and have been, is when you ask people, do you have a disability? If that's just an outright question, over half will say yes and more than one. 60% right now is what we're finding that identify that they have they have a disability, and it's more than one. And sometimes they'll say yes plus a mental health issue is often how it comes out, because those are typically separate categories, right? So it's sort of an on top of. So yes, I have a physical disability with a mental health issue. And so that's how it's often referred to. But that's what we're noticing. And then you see some differences with other identities and different backgrounds come into play, gender, race, sexuality, certainly intersectionality of all of that. Um, and I think we're noticing that because no oppression stands alone. There are so many things that play into a person's identity. So if you see an attitude of someone where the person is maybe looking down on this particular group, it doesn't just impact that group, it impacts everyone. Oppression is pervasive. And so for me, that is very important that we identify that and that we do address intersectionality. Absolutely. Yeah, because that's a big one.
Such a great point, and it's an amazing example. Thank you, Wendy, for the question. We have another question from Samuel. What practical steps can we take to ensure that people with disabilities feel included? Many often feel neglected, and this leads to feelings of inferiority, causing them to avoid participating in society.
Well, the first thing is practice. Think about your language, the words that you use, um, just things that we say and read and write every day. For example, and this is just one example that I give often, is here in the United States, the English word crazy. It's it means a psychological disability, right? But we use it to mean someone or something is not behaving how we expected, and it often has a negative connotation like, ugh, that's crazy, with a negative facial expression with it. Or we find it humorous. We use it in a, quote, funny way. We make light of it and use that word trying to separate ourselves from them. Ugh, she's crazy. Very, very judgy. That's how that is often said. But I got to tell you, that's really common. I sometimes, if I'm not thinking and if I'm not on top of it, it'll just come out of my mouth or off of my hands. And I still use that. But I do have a sort of accountability buddy. And so we have decided we are going to replace that word with bananas instead of the word crazy. We'll say bananas, and we just have an agreement. And so, for example, that situation is bananas. So she's my bananas friend. And so it's that one word. And the moment if it crosses my mind, I swap it out. So that's just a thought. Start with your language use. And what are we representing things in an equitable way? Is there a disparity? I mean, I could give you a list of things, but that's just my one quick and easy example is language use. And so, yeah, I think that's a great place to start for folks.
Awesome. Thank you. And Samuel, if you have any additional questions or would like to respond, feel free to do so. So if there's another question in the chat, feel free to add it. But I have another one for you, Dr. Cawthon. So when it comes to ableist viewpoints, how do we shift those mindsets that you mentioned earlier? The status quo is immense. There's a lot of resistance, and there's ableism that people have embedded who are disabled, and there's ableism that you're not conscious of. So when it comes to that mindset and curiosity, what invitation or even language would you encourage people to use to shift that and engage?
Well, I have a lot of different examples that I could pull from. I think, it depends on the situation. So if I don't know the person, let's say that's the situation. Maybe typically social media or an email, LinkedIn might be a situation. And someone, let's say they send me an email or there's a post that I have access to. And something feels a little off, let's say, and it feels and reads as ableist. I would send them a direct message and say something to the effect of, have you considered your word usage here, and then maybe explain a little bit. Maybe they just don't know. I prefer to assume the best. Maybe they just don't know. So I'd like to address it like that, and then maybe offer a suggestion as a replacement of a term or a word. I try to be very humble and respectful. I don't say, I'm offended by that. I do not lead with that. I do not say that. I'll lead with, have you considered, or here are some other options to this particular term. For example, I think it was yesterday, someone posted on Instagram a picture. It was visual, and it was awful in terms of access. Accessibility was tragic. The background was very, very busy. It was light in color with white font. The text was in white. And the post said something like, can you tell me if you like my post? So it was really an invitation to respond because they said, can you tell me? And so I did. And so what I just responded with, hey, honestly, it would be easier if I could see it more clearly. Maybe consider a different background or contrasting colors of your text. Maybe check in. And then I gave a web address where you could kind of check the contrasting colors just for a check in there. So I provided resources in that response. And I didn't make it about me or them. I made it about the thing, the word, the picture, or whatever it is that you're wanting to address. And each time I've done that, people are really very actually grateful. They say, oh my gosh, thank you for telling me. I didn't know, I didn't realize, I didn't know how to do it different. So that's a really good one for me. And that's if I don't know you. Now, harder for me personally is people I do know and trying to address that, especially if it's, say, a supervisor or someone who's sort of like, for lack of a better way to describe it, higher ranking than I am. If they say something or their behavior is really bad and off-putting, that's difficult. Sometimes I will put it in writing. I will choose not to address it directly in person in that moment. If I have to, I will then also see their boss if I find it necessary. Then they know that I mean business, that this is needs to be addressed. Now, sometimes I'll say something to the effect of, oh gosh, for example, there was this one situation where it was a really senior guy, sort of the top rung here. And he said, I can't give access to that because I don't know how. So what I said, oh, so that's interesting. We've now made it about you, not the person needing the access, right? So this is what I'm thinking when he says this. And so I thought, all right, let's hold for a moment and back up. What skills do you need? What talent do you need? What kind of access do you need that you feel you can't do or provide? And so I actually said this to the man, and then he was still resistant. So I said, okay. Turns out this is an ADA issue, so we are now entering an illegal space here. We are not allowed to say no because of your skill or lack thereof. That is illegal. Then he responded, oh, I didn't realize. So again, the intention for this person was not about disabled people. It was more about how they perceive themselves because they didn't have that skill. And so we're like, well, I can't do it because I don't know. And so I just kind of wrapped that around and said, it's then not about that. It's about, well, who do we need to bring in? What more do we need to make this happen? Because we need to make this happen. It's not about the person who doesn't have the skill. It's about providing that access, especially when we're, again, dealing with a legal issue and an ADA potential violation. So
Amazing. You gave two powerful examples, one being a less intimate connection that hopefully results in a positive outcome, and the second being something that's charged. It's someone you know, there's power dynamics, and there's legal. So thank you for sharing both of those. I hope that resonated with other people who are looking to be advocates as well as understanding how to explore that if they've ever been in that situation. We have a question in the chat as well as a comment. And just to honor time, Dr. Cawthon is here till 6, so I will choose between the two. We also have another question. So the first is asking for accessibility resources for teaching regarding visible as well as individuals who are deaf. So any general guidance.
Well, for deaf people and teaching deaf students, I'm happy to send you resources. I'll put it in the chat box if you want resources for my website for the center, the National Deaf Center on Post-Secondary Outcomes for students. I'm happy to put that in the chat. Give me one moment, please, because all you got to do is click on the link and lots and lots of resources for you there. So that's a big one for deaf students. So within the United States, there are a whole host of different organizations with resources for sure. Uh, Technical resources right now are very important to leverage when considering this. Think about technology and how that can support learning in different environments and contexts. That's improving every day, every year. So always take a look at that. And there are lots of organizations who focus on that. I don't have something off the top of my head that I can add to the chat right now, but I'm happy to think about it. If you want to reach out, I'm happy to try to put you in touch with some additional resources.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing the link and for the encouragement to explore more additional resources. This is going to be our last question for Dr. Cawthon, and this is from G. Is there a change or progress made recently in creating the education/career pipeline successfully accommodating a disability? This effort is encouraging to me, and I appreciate this. Thank you.
Yes, the answer is yes. So what we've seen within the last 15 years, an enrollment for students with disabilities, it's doubled, which is huge. We've never had a change that big, that fast in that short amount of time. And so seeing people with disabilities enrolling in post-secondary spaces, training and education is just awesome. And it's happening. The time is now, it's happening. Now the gaps are still there. And the biggest ones that we've noticed are career advancements. The school systems are changing and they're quicker than private companies and businesses often. So that's a little bit of a tougher space. That's more challenging from what we've noticed. But then it's also on an individual level, like one person applies and they've got a disability. It's then not about the small system. It's a smaller system, because you're changing for one person. You've got 2,000 students in a district, and then 10 of them have a disability. You can do a lot more. There's more expansion, there are more change happening. So on an individual kind of one-off level, and companies, and there's a lot of small businesses out there who don't have the resources or knowledge or all the things. And so I have seen some opportunities for businesses networking together, and that seems to be helping, and that seems to be the most effective with the highest impact in terms of the numbers and changing and working in those spaces, and businesses coming together and learning from each other, those owners of smaller businesses, because they often trust each other, right? Oh, you own a small business. What does that mean if you hire a person with a disability? Help me in that space. And so that seems to be a really successful model, is networking and connecting small business owners together to figure out how to accommodate new employees with disabilities. So that's been a real big thing that we've seen as well.
Amazing. Thank you. And I hope that answered questions for everyone today. I'd like to encourage you all to put in the chat gratitude for Dr. Stephanie Cawthon's for insights, for her examples, for the research that she's doing, as well as her powerful book. I'm going to be dropping in the chat a link to access it as well. And just thank you so much for being here, for sharing your insights, and appreciate it greatly. And if there's anything you'd like to share afterwards, feel free.
Well, I just wanted to say thank you so much for having me, and I hope that the rest of your event goes so well. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you, Amanda. Thank you, Stephen.
All right, you all have a good evening. Thanks. Bye bye.
All right. So I hope everyone takes a moment to let that sink in. And so grateful that we had the opportunity to hear from Dr. Stephanie Cawthon. I'd like to take a moment to encourage you all to scan this QR code, give feedback, let us know what you liked, what you didn't like, what resonated with you. This will be available after the call as well. So this is an opportunity for us to engage throughout. And if there's anyone who's looking to find additional resources for accessibility in any venture or in any capacity, add that to the comments. Let us know what you need so that connections can be made. So let's take a quick stretch break. We've already been on the call for an hour. There's a moment of just learning. So elevate your hands, stretch, do whatever micro movements or bold movements you need to make. Take a quick breath. I'll direct us through some breathing flow real quick before introducing our next speaker. So close your eyes, relax the shoulders, and slowly inhale. Exhale. Once more, breathe in, exhale. Thank you for being here. Thank you for engaging. Thank you for listening. That was a lot of diving into something challenging and also learning. And that's what we're here for. So our next speaker is Rhiannon Gallagher. They have a master's in business psychology and is certified in appreciative inquiry, systems thinking, and creative leadership. She is the founder of Parents for the Planet, an international eco-grief support group that started in 2016 to help inactive planet parents find ways to overcome the overwhelm and help burnt out activists find rejuvenation. Today, it includes over 1,000 members from more than 40 countries. She is also a board member for more than 40, she's also a board member, excuse me, of Southern Plains Land Trust and is a fellow for Team Project 54 International, a focused group on SDG 13, and they are focusing on resilience in the global south. She lives in Denver, Colorado, and runs an entrepreneurial coaching company called Team Leading. Let's send some gratitude and acknowledgement, and I'm so grateful that you're here with us today. Please welcome Rhiannon.
Hi, I'm so glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
Awesome. So I wanted you specifically to be engaged in this because Parents for the Planet is one, a killer name, but it's also a way of reflecting something that Dr. Cawthon mentioned earlier about community, about shifting status quos and encouraging connections. So I'd love for you to share a little bit more about your work. I have some questions for you as well, but if anyone wants to add additional questions, feel free to do so in the chat. And can you introduce the slide to us?
Yeah, I'm not seeing the slides. Let me
Oh,
get to a point where I can see the slides.
okay. It's the 8 steps to overcoming the overwhelm.
Yeah, I don't know why I'm not seeing slides. That would help.
Anyone else see slides? I just want to make sure I'm properly sharing them.
Yeah, it must just be me. So weird.
Wendy, is that a yes? Yeah, okay. It's okay. I know this happens to me often. You have two Zoom screens, and there's the one that has all the gallery view, and then there's the other one.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
happens.
So, yeah, so I'll tell you sort of, let me tell you a little bit about how Parents for the Planet got started, and that'll help this make sense. So, so Parents for the Planet sort of came out of three things. It came out of my mom and I started it. My mom died in 2020, but she she and her book club read The Sixth Great Extinction and got just as a group incredibly depressed, like which is understandable when you read The Sixth Great Extinction, I think. And they were a group of incredibly there were ERA people, there were civil rights people in there, and they just kind of got frozen and overwhelmed by reading that book. And I was like, well, that's not helpful. Um, I'm glad that this book had all this great information, but if it freezes people up to the point that that they don't feel like there's any point in doing anything, then that's not good. So that's the first thing that happened. The second thing that happened was that I went to an event that was sort of labeled as a climate action. Let's get all the climate activists together event. And it was somebody who had sort of recently learned about the climate crisis in 2016. This was new information for her, and she was furious. She was just in her sort of anger phase of grief, and she wanted everybody else to be in their anger phase of grief too. And a lot of us had been aware of this before 2016, and we weren't in that anger phase of grief anymore. And she was a little frustrated with us that we weren't sort of in the same grief stage that she was in. And that was insightful for me because there were a lot of people there who were very active and who were doing a lot of things, but were doing those things from different places. Um, and and we sort of sat and watched the energy that she was putting into her anger and thought, wow, and that looks exhausting. Like we're we weren't sure how sustainable that level of fury was going to be. And we were a little worried for her, frankly. So that was the second sort of event that started Parents for the Planet. And the third thing that I don't bring up always, but I think this group will understand is that I have a chronic illness, and that means that I don't, particularly in 2016 when I didn't have all my medications dialed in, I didn't always have days when I had all my spoons. And those of you who have chronic illness knows what that means. I didn't have days when not every day was a day when I had all of my energy levels operating at peak efficiency. And I had a 10-year-old kid at the time, and I didn't necessarily want to take my best days when I was feeling at my healthiest and spend them um, sitting in my congressperson's office and yelling at them. I didn't necessarily want to spend them uh, um, at a rally. I wanted to spend them with my kid. I wanted to spend them in nature. I wanted to spend them with my family. I wanted to spend them doing things that brought me joy because those days were precious and few and far between. And and so I wanted to create a space where people who were overwhelmed could find ways to heal themselves up and find hope. I wanted to find a space where people could find ways to be active that that didn't necessarily come out of anger, but that came out of other stages of dealing with the reality of the climate situation. And I wanted to find ways that where you could be active, um, if you didn't have all your spoons, or if you had all your spoons, that your activism could come from places of joy. And so that's what led to the creation of Parents for the Planet, and that's what led to these 8 steps. So I'll talk through them, and I think as I talk through them, you'll find that some of them sort of resonate with some of the stuff that Dr. Cawthon talked about. So the first one is sort of be kind to yourselves, ourselves, and others, which has to do with nobody is the perfect environmentalist. Nobody is doing all the things every day. Um, and that we need to give ourselves grace for that. We don't ev- you use the plastic sometimes. You drive a place that maybe you could have found a public transportation to sometimes. And different people are coming to things that they have easier times making concessions for the planet that than other people do, right? And be kind about that. There isn't one absolute measure of what makes a good environmental steward. We need to stop sort of having purity tests around things and be kind about whatever people are doing. And I think in the disability community, that's particularly important because everybody has different capacities for what they're able to do in support, personally and in support in terms of activism, and we need to be graceful and give other people grace about that. The second one is finding art that expresses how we feel. I think the climate conversation is overwhelming a lot of times, and we don't have language for it, and we don't have ways to express it, but there are a lot of artists out there doing a lot of amazing work, and we seek out that art, and reward those artists. The third one, and we'll talk more about it later, is finding moments of awe. There's a lot of amazing things about this planet that we take care of, this planet that we nurture and parent. Um, and it's good to find those moments. We're supposed to have uh, Northern Lights all the way down to New Mexico tonight. So that's amazing, right? But those are moments of awe. Seeing the Northern Lights is a moment of awe. We should need to seek those out. That sort of renews why this planet is worth parenting, is worth taking care of. Um, Practicing gratitude is another big one. Finding things to be grateful for, finding people to be grateful for who are doing good work and making sure that they know that we appreciate them. Um, Doing positive activism, that's stuff that you can do from home, right? That's stuff like supporting the scientists doing a lot of citizen science, things that doesn't necessarily take a lot of energy, that doesn't necessarily mean you're putting yourself at risk of getting COVID, for example. There's a lot of things that you can do that are positive activism actions that move science forward, that move climate action forward, that you can do even if you have a disability, even if you have a social anxiety, even if crowds aren't your thing. There's all sorts of ways to be active, that are positive and don't come from anger. We spend a lot of time finding inspirational stories about people that are doing amazing work. And we spend a lot of time building community so that people who do worry about the climate and who do feel a responsibility to do something about it don't feel so alone, regardless of where they are, where they live, how much community they have physically around them. We try to make sure that we're making those connections. And finally, we spend a lot of time visualizing the future we can create. One of the things that we know is that it's very hard to do progressive work. It's very hard to create that regenerative and inclusive planet because we haven't seen it yet. We don't know what it looks like because it hasn't been here yet. We have to consciously define it over and over and over again and say, well, we know we can pull this from these indigenous cultures, and we can pull this from this fiction, and we can pull this from this art. We have to keep on doing that visualization work because the people that are trying to regress know what they're visualizing because it's been here before. So we have to be very explicit about visualizing the future that we can create so that we know what we're working toward, because it's always easier to work towards something that you can see. It's very hard to work towards something that isn't tangibly out there that you can aim for. And so that eighth piece is really crucial for us. So those are our 8 steps.
That is amazing. Thank you for sharing them and breaking them down. The last one, obviously, that's really connected to today's theme is that envisioning the future. And yes, there's a comment in the chat, just absolutely brilliant, like a reflection that it is very easy to create the status quo, to create what we know versus envision something that we can't see yet. And today we're going to have two breakout rooms. One of them is very much about this question. But before we dive into that, I'd like to know a little bit more about your work with Southern Plains Lane Trust or Team Project 54 International. How do they
Yeah, so
relate to this visioning?
um those are two um those are two things that I do that are positive activism. As I've gotten healthier and as I've gotten my chronic illness under control, I've been able to sort of take more positive activism on. So Southern Plains Land Trust is an organization that works in the Southern Plains states. The shortgrass prairie is the most endangered ecosystem in North America. It is and it exists in Colorado, Texas, Oklahoma, and New Mexico. It is the native ecosystem of the bison, of the black-footed ferret, of prairie dogs, and it's a very complicated and very precious ecosystem that we're trying to protect by buying land and restoring it, taking out fences from ranches and running buffalo and bringing back black-footed ferrets, which are the most endangered mammal in North America, and putting and running it on our land. So we have about 65,000 acres of land in southern Colorado, and then we're working to expand out to other states. So that's an example of the positive activism that I do. And then Team Project 54 is is run out of Nigeria, actually. Hi, Samuel. Um, and it's an organization that's about sharing global solutions across the global South for how to communicate about climate change effectively, and how to communicate about solutions in global South countries effectively. We just had our Team Project 54 team was just part of the World Sustainability Cup, which was an international competition around sustainable manufacturing that we had a bunch of teams from around the world compete, European teams, North American teams, and our Pan-African team won the entire event. Um, and we're incredibly proud of that. Getting Nigerian voices and South African voices and Liberian voices into global climate solutions is part of what Team Project 54 does, and making sure that African voices and global South voices are getting heard in solutions is sort of where Team Project 54 is focused.
Amazing. And Samuel in the chat said they would like to
Yes.
join Team
Yeah,
Project
Samuel,
54.
find me on LinkedIn, Samuel. We will set you up.
Samuel joined our first Resilient Minds Inclusive Planet, so I'm thrilled you're here and connecting with like-minded people. Um, I'm going to ask one more question just before we break into our room. And the area that I'd like to explore is, you mentioned the eco grief earlier as an activation for why this group started. And also your own experiences of having grief, but also not having energy to really show up. So when it comes to capacity and it comes to finding ways of overcoming the overwhelm, what would be the first step on recognizing your burnout or if your grief is healthy?
Um, I, I think the the grief is real, right? And everybody, and it's not going anywhere, right? This is the hardest part about eco grief is that it's so unrelenting that it's not like uh it's not like the cat dies and you get another cat. It's not like, like there's no end of this. And it goes and it's constantly waving in and out and we have to give ourselves so much grace. So much grace. And I think there's been since when I started Parents for the Planet, almost nobody was talking about eco grief. And we're doing such a better job of acknowledging the fact that it exists now. And we owe so much, frankly, to Gen Z because they are so much more in tune with their emotions and with acknowledging what they're feeling. And I commend this generation for that. They are excellent in a thousand ways. Um, I think but what we have to acknowledge, we have to give ourselves permission for the roller coaster and to recognize that it does bottom out, but it also goes back up. We also, I think what's important for me and what took a long time to to recognize is we have to give ourselves permission to be present, right? We can get so consumed with how bad it's going to get, how bad it's going to be, that we forget to acknowledge the now. And I actually, on our Patreon, I actually wrote up an essay about this because I think, um, nothing would be more heartbreaking, for example, in Colorado, than for me to be so concerned about the fact that in 40 years we may have no snow in Colorado, than for me to not get out and appreciate the heck out of the snow that we have now. So that in 40 years, when a great grandkid asks me what snow was like, I had sure better have noticed it. I have sure better have really been present for it. Like I need to be so present for for what I have right now. And that that has knowing how present I have to be for what we have at this moment has really been powerful for me and has really pushed me out of some of that ego grief because I'm like, oh, I have to notice. It has been a uh, imperative meditation.
Hmm. I like that imperative meditation, the reminder to be present so that you can show up for yourself, but also take action when you have the energy and acknowledge all emotional ranges that experience, whether it's in your activism or in your just everyday life. And I think that's a beautiful reminder for all of us to just be present and grateful for our current situations so that whether we like them or not, you're still breathing. We're on a Zoom call right now. We're engaging in thought and using our brains and connecting with people across the globe, which is an amazing privilege and opportunity for us to connect and expand. So with that, we're going to have two breakout rooms. I'm going to pause the recording. So this opportunity is for you just to share, just to connect with people and to focus on. And that question is, what would a regenerative and inclusive planet mean to you? So in a moment, I'm going to open the breakout rooms. I'm going to pause the recording. You can engage with this if you'd like. I'd hope so. But I want to honor that everyone's bandwidth and spoons might be different. So if you'd like to just chill out in the main room, that's okay too. But there'll be two breakout rooms and so maybe one to three people in each of them. All right. I'm gonna open the rooms and pause the record. Okay. All right. So we had a question. What does an inclusive and regenerative planet mean to you? So does anyone want to share? We had two breakout rooms. Anyone want to share from group one with Rhiannon?
If you want me to summarize. We got off on a wonderful discussion of permaculture, and permaculture is fantastic because it is both regenerative and inclusive, and because you can apply it not just, people think of it as just a way to do agriculture and multi-layered regenerative agriculture, but it's also we have a guy in Denver who teaches it. It teaches how to do permaculture as communities and how to have multiple layers of support system within a community, and it's just sort of a way to design communities that have all the pieces parts that you need, and so we sort of got off on the permaculture tangent in all sorts of really good ways, and now we're all going to go live on a homestead together, and it's going to be grand. So glad we worked that out. Let the world go where it wants.
I love that. Thank you. Awesome. We have some hearts in the chat and smiley faces. I was part of group two, but I'm leading. So does anyone else want to speak or share their voice on topics? To be honest, we talked about a lot of different things. So Wendy, Godson, Naveen.
I don't know. I mean, gosh, we kind of got off on a tangent. I'm not sure exactly how to say what all we talked about. We did talk about space, which was cool, and you know, if human beings ended up living on the moon or on Mars or in other ways in space, how would we prevent what's happening here from happening there? How would we, protect wherever we were? And we also talked about the complexity of politics in the United States today with people um, who deny climate change, and also people who um, are want to legislate things about people's sexual orientation or gender identity, um, and how that makes this work that much harder. But and also the kind of expert novice continuum that people think that if they've watched a lot of TikTok videos and read a lot of websites that they're an expert on something, and how true experts are often dismissed. So, I mean, that's just, those are the things we talked about, but it wasn't so much about our question, I guess.
It's okay. I think that's part of it. It's like sometimes you need to share in a different way. And it's an opportunity for us to kind of explore different ways of thinking about the present because space is relevant to inclusive planets, thinking about the moon and thinking about other places that we might venture. That's not even the 5 year timeline, that's the 10 year, 20. And, thinking about how those politics, if we want to shift things, talking about them is relevant. So, uh, all is welcome. We have an opportunity now to think about that positive activism. And I'm going to quickly ask you to think about that question. Think about, can you all see a screen? And I think it's not sharing. Okay. Um, the question really is positive activism and how you can create positive activism. How can you usher in awe? And that's going to be the theme of our next breakout. Just be about 5 minutes or so. But Rhiannon, before I assign or create them again, anything you'd like to share?
Yeah, let me talk a little bit about how sort of how those two things sort of manifested, give you some examples for how those things have manifested in Parents for the Planet. Um, so for example, when the Trump administration started, we sort of combined our gratitude practices and our positive activism practices, and we started what we called thank you brigades here in Denver. Denver has more federal employees than any other place outside Washington, D.C. So the NREL, the National Renewable Energy Labs, are here. The headquarters for the National Park Service are here. We've got an EPA headquarters here. Like, we just have a lot of federal employees here, and they were really, really depressed and frightened. And so we started these things called thank you brigades, and we would gather all of these thank you notes from people, and then we would show up like outside the NREL labs with these great big thank you signs as these federal employees were going into work and say, "Hey, thank you for working on climate. Thank you for working on renewable energy. Thank you for working for the National Park Service." Um, Positive activism, right? Like just letting these employees know that while they were feeling sort of threatened, that there were all sorts of people who really appreciated them. Um, and it was gratitude practice, it was positive activism practice. It felt great to be taking a break from the protests for a little bit, right? And these like big like burly like renewable energy engineers would come out sobbing, can I get a picture of you with my that I can send to my mom? Like they really needed that. So that's an example of positive activism. And then there was during COVID, a lot of the positive activism ended up being um, going on to Zooniverse and finding, like Snapshot Serengeti and doing a lot of things that we could do from home, helping out with, you know, going through camera shots for citizen activism, stuff that we could just do while we were sort of sitting in our houses by ourselves. That's positive activism too. That helps scientists, that helps climate. So there are all sorts of creative ways to sort of get that positive energy boost. So that's the positive activism piece. The awe piece, I talked a little bit about sort of being present. I love awe. Like I like just to put the neuroscience cap on. Like I am such a huge awe fan, y'all. Like awe, it does oxytocin, it does serotonin, it does dopamine. Like it is the best brain chemistry ever, right? And you can find it in like big, like go look at the aurora borealis ways, and you can find it in take a little time and really get into a leaf, find your toddler brain kind of ways, right? But it is such a boost in terms of feeling connected to the universe, in terms of feeling connected to the planet, in terms of feeling connected to each other. Like, get more awe. I'm a fan. Like, it is good brain chemistry. Like, it will boost you out of that eco anxiety faster than almost any other emotion that you can have. So, so yes, more awe.